Okay, welcome. In this lesson, I'm going to show you the steps for what we call X-factoring. We're going to on trinomials. So I'm going to show you the general steps first, and then we'll do an example together. If you want, you can pause the recording during the example to try to work it out yourself and see if you get the same answer as I do. Okay, here we go. Step one is to be sure your trinomial is in standard form. As a reminder of standard form, that's when we have a trinomial, which has three terms. We have a number times x squared plus a different number, perhaps, times x plus another number. The only real requirement for doing the X factoring is that we don't want a to equal 1. Because if a equals 1, then you will just use the regular guess and check method in order to factor the trinomials. After our factoring, our trinomials are going to turn into two binomials. And so that's our goal of this. Okay, so our second step is maybe an obvious one, and that would be to make an x. It should be large enough so that you can put numbers into it. So I'm going to make it about that big. After I make the x, I'm going to figure out the top and the bottom. So the top and the bottom will be these. We note that the leading coefficient is the a, and the second coefficient is b, and the third coefficient is c. So in the top, we're going to take a times c. So we're going to take those two numbers. Remember, a is not 1, but c could be 1, but we're going to multiply those two together. In the bottom, we're going to put the coefficient, the middle term coefficient b. And then we do something kind of silly. This is for the setup, but I'm going to put over here as a placeholder a triangle, and over on the right side a box. Okay, so that was step 2. As I set up the x, I put the numbers in the appropriate place on the top and the bottom, and then I put in, you'll see in the example that we don't actually use the triangle and the box. Okay, in step 3, is I'm going to use guessing and checking now, so I'm going to find factors of my AC such that when I add them together, it adds to B. So in other words, I'm going to find some triangle number times some box when multiplied equals my AC top number. And when I take those same two and I add them, it's going to equal my bottom B number. Okay, that's step 3. Step 4. This is after I've found those. I'm going to make some fractions. So I'm going to make fractions. And those fractions are going to be like this. I'm going to take the triangle, and the denominator for that is going to be A. I'm then going to take the box. The denominator for that will also be A. To use exactly the same number for the denominators. Okay, next, step 5. Step 5 is very critical, because if you don't do step 5, it's not going to work. But you reduce the fractions. Okay, so So I'm just going to call this reduce. And when I get something, it's going to look like this. So now I'm just going to label it A1 over, triangle 1 over A1. When I reduce the other one, the reason why I put the numbers on there is just to indicate that it is something different than what it was. So now I end up with those two new fractions. If it doesn't reduce, then you don't have to worry about that. Step 6 is to tip over the fractions. That sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? But it's as though we are going to push them up on top here, and then they fall over to the right. And so then they're going to look like this. It's going to look like the denominator on the first thing, and then we're going to put an x with it, plus the new triangle number. The other binomial will be the denominator, which may be different, times x plus the box. Does that make sense? It's kind of tipping over it. Okay, for the next step, we are going to do a check. Check by foiling. And the result of that foiling should give us our original problem. Okay, so those are the general steps. Now going to do an example. So you can write this down. We are going to do the problem 6x squared plus 5x minus 4. Okay, already we noticed that the leading coefficient is not 1, so that's why we're going to use the x factor. It's already in standard form. If it wasn't, we would have to move terms around so that it is in standard form. Standard form, of course, is with the x squared term first, and then the x term second, and then the constant term last. Okay, so next, step 2, we are going to make our big x. We're then going to identify the AC, so I'm just over here. This is going to be my A term, this is my B term, and this, I'm going to underline it with the negative sign, is the C term. Got it? So now I'm going to put at the top A times C, which is going to represent 6 times negative 4, which equals negative 24. So that number goes in the top bucket. I then grab the middle term coefficient and put it there. Notice there's no x's inside of the quadrants. So we don't use the variables, we just use the coefficients. Okay, so now I have to do a little bit of guessing checking. So now I'm going to find factors of negative 24 that add to 5. So one way to get the factors of negative 24 is you can list all of the factors. You can do a factor tree. You can do all those things that you did earlier in order to figure out what all the factors are. I generally just start at the beginning and say, all right, I'm going to take like negative 24 times 1. That gives me, if I multiply those, that equals negative 24. When I add negative 24 plus 1, That gives me negative 23. That is not 5. I then will just switch the negative sign over to the other term. So take 24 times negative 1. That gives me negative 24. 24 plus negative 1 gives me positive 23. That also is not 5. I then look at my list of factors, or think of my next factor. 24 is even, so 2 goes into it. So I get negative 12 times 2. That will multiply for negative 24, and negative 12 plus 2 will give me negative 10, closer to 5, but not. I then switch that around. Now, some of these things you're going to be doing in your head, and especially when it comes to positive and negatives, because as you switch the negative over, you know it's just going to change the sign on the sum. So that's positive 10. I have to show you all my steps so that, so everybody can understand it. So then I take negative 8 times 3, because I remember that 3 goes into 24. When I do that, negative 8 plus 3, that gives me negative 5, and I say, oh, that's very close, so that means 8 times negative 3, which is negative 24. When I add those two together, that in fact gives me my 5. That's what I'm looking for. That was my goal on doing all this guessing and checking. I do not have to check the negative 6 times 4 or the 6 times negative 4, because once you find this middle term here, or the b term, then you can stop. So as I said, some of this guessing and checking comes in your head. Okay, now I assign, because I found this, I assign the first thing my triangle, and the second one my box. It doesn't matter which order you put them in. So now I'm going to put the 8 here and the negative 3. I've completed my x now. That's the first sort of step, is to do your guessing and checking in order to do that. Okay, now, once I've completed that, I now am going to move to the step 4, and that is I'm going to write my fractions. So I'm going to take the 8, or the triangle over a, so that's going to be 8 over 6. Recall from the top there, that's a equals 6, so I'm going to make my first fraction that way. I am then going to take my box over a, so that is the negative 3 over 6. So we write the fractions first, and don't forget to do the next step, step 5, which is to reduce the fractions. To reduce the first one, I can see they're both even, so I'm going to divide the top and the bottom by 2. So that gives me the fraction 4 over 3. I'm going to leave it in fraction form because this is not a fraction exercise. I then look at my next fraction. They're both multiples of 3, so I'm going to divide both of those by the same number, 3. And so I am going to get negative 1 over 2. So those are my two fractions. And so now I am going to go on to the next step. And after I've already reduced those, so the next step is to tip them over. Okay, so you don't really have to tip them over, but you just take them, and this first one becomes 3x plus 4. So you can see that you're taking that, you're tipping it over. The denominator comes first with the x, and then the numerator comes second. I'm then going to write right next to it. I'm going to tip this one over and write it over there. So the denominator, again, comes first with the x, and then I'm going to write a minus 1. Could put plus a negative 1 if you wanted to. So those are my two binomials. I think that's going to be the answer, but of course I'm going to check because of course I am a good student like you. So my check will be that I take 3x plus 4 and FOIL it with 2x minus 1. And so I will go through that. So I take the first term and I multiply it by, that would be the first and the outside. So it's going to be 3x times 2x plus 3x times negative 1. I am then going to take the inside and last, complete my FOIL. So plus 4 times 2x plus 4 times negative 1. I'm then going to simplify. So I have 3x. Let's first simplify this one. 3x plus 2x is 6x squared. The next term, 3x times negative 1 is negative 3x. The next one, 4 times 2x is 8x. And then my last is a negative 4. I will collect like terms in the middle, 6x squared. And then negative minus 3x plus 8x is plus 5x minus 4. That is my original problem. So therefore, that is the correct binomial factor of our trinomial. And I realize there's lots of steps in those. After you do a few of them, it's going to be second nature to you. So, good luck on using the X factor.